Marta Vega adjusted the collar of her nurse's uniform, the fabric's impeccable whiteness, a lie against the darkness, consuming her from within. Her journey to the somber corridors of the Sanatorio Belmonte Maximum Security Asylum was not a career choice, but the final destination of a promise forged in the fire of pain and helplessness. The old Marta, the nursing student who dreamed of saving lives, died the day the justice system failed her younger sister, sentencing her assailants to psychiatric treatment instead of a prison cell. This new Marta, a calculating shadow with empty eyes, was born with a single purpose: to become the angel of death that the system refused to be. Before you judge my actions, I ask that you try to understand my pain. I want my story to be heard, and for that I need at least 1,000 brave people to subscribe to this channel and be my witnesses. Comment where you're listening from, so I know I'm not completely alone in this darkness. The air in the asylum was heavy, a suffocating mix of disinfectant, sweat, and a despair so palpable it seemed to condense on the moisture-stained walls. The corridors were long and labyrinthine, lit by fluorescent lights that buzzed incessantly, casting a sickly glow on the worn linoleum floors. Every echo of footsteps, every muffled scream from behind steel doors, served as a constant soundtrack to the madness that dwelled there. For Marta, this place was not a treatment center. It was a mausoleum for the living, a purgatory where lost souls wandered with no hope of redemption, and that was precisely why she had chosen it. This oppressive environment, which would crush the spirit of any sane person, was the perfect ecosystem for her hunt, a place where death could easily be mistaken for just another symptom of the general decay. Her routine was a mask of competence and dedication. Marta administered medications, checked vital signs, and updated patient charts with a robotic precision that impressed her superiors. However, behind the facade of professionalism, her eyes were those of a predator sizing up its prey. She didn't see patients, she saw targets. Her fingers, as they flipped through medical records, weren't searching for information to heal, but for vulnerabilities, allergies, weaknesses that could be exploited. Each name on her list, seared into her memory, corresponded to a face she studied with a cold intensity. She was there to ensure that the diagnosis of psychopathic disorder that spared them from prison would become the cause of their inevitable and painful deaths, one by one, in a way that would seem like a tragic accident. The first interaction that solidified her presence in the asylum was with Anna, an older nurse whose hunched shoulders and weary gaze told the story of decades lost in that place. "Be careful with the ones who seem the most sane, dear," Anna advised her during a shift change, her voice a hoarse whisper. "They're the ones who know exactly how to break you." Marta just nodded, offering a restrained, grateful smile, a performance of a naive rookie. But inside, she felt a dark connection to Anna's warning. She perfectly understood the manipulation that flourished in that environment. The difference was that, unlike the other staff who tried to protect themselves, Marta was there to dive headfirst into this game of deceit, using the same psychological weapon her targets used to dominate and destroy. Fragments from the day of the trial would assault her in moments of silence. The image of the judge's gavel falling, a dull thud that sealed her fate. The words, "unfit to stand trial," echoing in the courtroom as subtle, victorious smiles formed on the faces of her sister's attackers. The diagnosis of psychopathy, once a terrifying anomaly, had become their shield, a license for cruelty that the legal system endorsed. It was in that instant, sitting on the cold courtroom bench, that Marta's hope in justice shattered, and in its place a piercing ice formed in her heart. The pain gave way to a terrible clarity. If the world would not give them what they deserved, she herself would become the judge, jury, and executioner. Vengeance was no longer an option. It was a physiological necessity, like breathing. Her presence did not go unnoticed by Dr. Almeida, the chief psychiatrist. He was a middle-aged man with eyes that seemed to see through the facades people constructed. From his glass-walled office, which looked more like an observation tank, he watched her with analytical curiosity. He noticed her almost inhuman efficiency, her unflappable calm in the face of outbursts that made other nurses recoil. To him, Marta didn't fit the profile. She lacked the nervousness of a newcomer or the cynicism of a veteran. There was a stillness to her, a focused intensity that left him uneasy. He didn't suspect the truth yet, but his instinct, honed by years of dealing with the most twisted minds, told him that the new nurse was more than she appeared. The confirmation that she was in the right place came when she had her first direct contact with one of them. Patient Zero, as she nicknamed him in her mind, was the group's charismatic leader. As she handed him his nightly medication, their eyes met. He smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his dead eyes. "New nurse," he said, his voice a deceptive velvet. "I hope you enjoy our company. We can be very persuasive." The veiled threat hung in the air, a test to see if she would falter. Marta kept her expression neutral, her heart hammering against her ribs, not from fear, but from a glacial fury. She simply replied, "Just take your medicine, sir. It's for your own good." The subtext of her words was a silent promise. Redemption would not come from a cure, but from the dose she herself would choose. At the end of her first shift, Marta locked herself in a rarely used bathroom at the back of C Wing. The facade of control crumbled, and she leaned against the sink, breathless, her hands shaking. She looked at her reflection in the stained mirror. The eyes staring back were not her own. They were the eyes of a hunter, cold, determined, frightening. She took a small silver locket from her pocket. Inside was a faded photo of her sister smiling, her innocence still intact. She squeezed it tightly, the cold metal digging into her palm. The physical pain anchored her, transforming grief into fuel. "This is for you," she whispered to the reflection, her voice steady, the promise renewed. The old Marta was dead and buried. From that night on, there was only vengeance. It happened on a rainy Tuesday during recreation time in the maximum security wing. Marta was restocking the emergency cart, a mundane task that allowed her to move through the common areas without raising suspicion. In a dimly lit corner of the room, 4 of the men from her list were gathered around a metal table playing cards. Their laughter was loud and uninhibited, a grotesque sound that echoed through the cavernous hall, devoid of any genuine joy. Among them was Patient Zero, watching the game with an air of bored superiority, while the other 3 acted as his court of jesters. Marta kept her head down, her movements deliberately slow, becoming part of the furniture, a shadow in a white uniform that no one would notice. She felt their occasional glances, but they were looks of casual assessment, not suspicion. They saw her as they saw all the other nurses, an object, a service, something to be used or ignored. It was then that the conversation shifted, and the air in the room seemed to grow thicker and colder. Ricardo, the youngest and most impulsive of the group, threw his cards on the table in frustration and, to deflect from his loss, began to boast. The talk slid to the past, to the crimes that brought them there. With a cruel smile, he began to reminisce about the night of the attack on Marta's sister, not with remorse, but with a sick nostalgia. He described the fear in her eyes, mimicking her terrified screams, with a mockery that made Marta's blood run cold. "She thought she could fight," he said, and the others laughed, a cacophony of cruelty. "But in the end, she got real quiet, just like they all do." The memory of her sister, her pain, her humiliation was being desecrated, turned into a dirty anecdote to entertain monsters. In that instant, Marta's world contracted to that man and his profane laughter. The buzz of the fluorescent lights became a high-pitched scream in her ears. The smell of disinfectant was replaced by the metallic scent of her own hatred. Her hand, holding a sterile syringe, gripped the object so tightly that the plastic groaned in protest, nearly snapping. The facade of the cold, controlled nurse disintegrated, revealing the volcanic fury boiling beneath. For one terrifying second, she imagined herself crossing the room and plunging the syringe into Ricardo's neck, an impulse so overwhelming that her entire body trembled with the effort to contain it. She was a caged animal, and the bars of her sanity were bending dangerously. It was the primal pain of a wound being ripped open again with salt and scorn. With a superhuman effort, she turned and walked away in stiff, controlled steps, her body a ticking time bomb. She took refuge in a supply closet, the smell of bleach and clean linens, a bizarre contrast to the filth she felt in her soul. There, in the cramped darkness, leaning against cold metal shelves, the decision solidified. The plan, once a methodical strategy to be executed with patience, became an urgent, visceral necessity. There would be no more waiting, no more observation. The hunt would begin that night. Ricardo, with his filthy mouth and his selective memory, would be the first. His death would not be just an execution, it would be an act of purification, a necessary silencing. The question was no longer if she could do it, but how she would. Ensure his suffering was maximized before the end. It was there, among boxes of gauze and bottles of saline, that I understood the true nature of justice. It is not a right guaranteed by laws, but an act of will in a world that often favors evil. That laughter was the trigger that reminded me why I was there and why I could no longer back down. Do you understand now? The journey I began was not for pleasure, but out of absolute necessity. That's why I need you to subscribe and share my story. When the system fails so spectacularly, the stories of the victims and of those who refuse to remain victims must be heard. They are a warning that when justice becomes blind, vengeance begins to see with terrifying clarity. The night Ricardo would die began with a ritualistic silence. In her tiny, anonymous room, Marta prepared the instruments of her justice. It wouldn't be a syringe with an obvious poison, but a calculated combination of medications. From Ricardo's chart, she knew of his slight cardiac arrhythmia and the medication he took to control it. In her hands, she held a potent beta blocker, stolen from the supply in small amounts over weeks. Mixed with his nightly dose of sedative, it wouldn't be lethal to a healthy man. But for him, whose heart was already a faulty clock, the overdose would slow his heart rate slowly and inexorably until it simply stopped. It would be a silent death, peaceful in appearance, a cruel contradiction to the violence he had inflicted. Every movement was precise, the nurse within her ensuring the executioner's effectiveness. The walk to Ricardo's cell was the longest of her life. Each footstep echoed in the empty corridors, a drumbeat announcing the point of no return. The security cameras had blind spots she had obsessively mapped, and she moved through them like a ghost. A night guard passed her in the hall, offering a sleepy nod, and Marta responded with a calm smile, her heart hammering against her ribcage like a trapped bird. Fear was an electric current under her skin, but her determination was an anchor of ice. She felt no hesitation, only the crushing weight of what she was about to do. She was crossing a line from which she could never return, trading the fragments of her soul for a measure of bloody retribution. Inside the cell, Ricardo slept, a soft snore escaping his lips. The dim light from the hallway painted his figure in a ghostly manner. For an instant, Marta saw him not as a monster, but as a vulnerable human being. The image of her sister, however, flashed in her mind, sharp and painful, and the hesitation crumbled to dust. With the gentleness of an experienced professional, she swapped the medicine cup by his bed with the one she had prepared. Then she gently shook Ricardo's shoulder. "Time for your meds," she whispered. He opened his sleep-clouded eyes and swallowed the contents without question, a lamb trusting its shepherd. Marta watched, impassive, as he lay back down and his eyes closed again. She remained there for a moment, listening to the cadence of his breathing begin to falter, a metronome slowing to its final silence. The discovery the next morning caused a muted stir. Ricardo was found lifeless in his bed. The doctor on duty, an overworked and exhausted man, declared the death to be from cardiac arrest, a logical conclusion given the notes in his file. No one questioned it. Death was a common occurrence in that asylum, a place where bodies and minds unraveled with equal speed. Marta participated in the ensuing routine, listening to the whispers of other staff, offering to help with the paperwork, her expression a mask of serene compassion. Inside, however, she felt a frigid emptiness. There was none of the catharsis she had expected, no satisfaction of revenge. There was only the silence where a monster used to be, and the heavy knowledge that his blood, though invisible, was now on her hands. Dr. Almeida, however, was not satisfied with the simplicity of the situation. In his office, he reviewed Ricardo's file for the third time. Cardiac arrest was plausible, but the timing was too convenient. He pulled up the service log from the previous night. Nurse Vega was on duty, the same new, efficient and enigmatic nurse. He magnified the security camera footage from the hallway, watching her calm, controlled passage. There was nothing out of the ordinary, no hint of transgression. Still, his intuition, the same that helped him decipher the most complex lies of his patients, screamed that a piece of the puzzle was missing. He had no proof, only a nagging hypothesis. Ricardo's death had not been an accident, but a message, and he suspected who the sender was. No one prepared me for the bitter taste of justice. I imagined I would feel relief, perhaps even peace, but what came was a deafening silence in my soul. Taking a life, even one that deserved death, leaves an indelible mark, a stain that never washes out. It is a burden I chose to carry because the alternative, inaction, was unthinkable. If you understand the complexity of this choice, if you have ever faced an injustice so great it made you question everything, then I need you to subscribe. I need to know there are others who understand that sometimes, to cleanse the world, you must dirty your own hands. Your subscription is an acknowledgement that this fight, as dark as it is, needs to be told. With the first piece on her macabre chessboard removed, Marta turned her attention to the next target, Sergio, a man whose brutality was masked by a veneer of servility. Repeating the medication method was too risky, especially with Almeida's eyes on her. She needed something that aligned with Sergio's profile. In his files, she found what she was looking for, a history of rage-fueled outbursts and self-destructive behavior, including an incident where he had broken his own hand, punching a wall. Violence was his language, and Marta decided to use it against him. The plan was more complex, requiring the manipulation not of chemicals, but of the environment itself, turning the familiarity of the asylum into a lethal weapon. She found her opportunity in the hydrotherapy wing, an old and rarely used area with cracked tile tubs and exposed plumbing. Sergio had a session scheduled, prescribed to help manage his aggression. The night before, Marta slipped into the deserted room. With tools stolen from the maintenance closet, she methodically sabotaged the electrical system of an old heating lamp above the main tub, exposing the wires and weakening the fixture holding it to the damp ceiling. The work required a cold-bloodedness that surprised her. She was no longer just an executioner. She was becoming an architect of death, designing accidents with the same precision with which she once measured doses of medicine. The risk was immense, but her audacity grew with each successful step on her path of vengeance. During a shift change, Erna commented on Ricardo's death with a shrug. "One less headache for us," she said, without a hint of malice, only the weariness of someone who had seen it all. "People like that can't be fixed. They're just an expense until the day the devil claims them." Anna's words, spoken so casually, struck Marta in an unexpected way. It was a dark echo of her own thoughts, a validation from an unlikely source. For a moment, she felt less alone in her crusade, as if this jaded woman, without knowing it, was an ally in her silent war. the banality of evil, and the indifference it bred was the fertile ground where Marta's plan flourished. Sergio's accident was chaotic and loud, the opposite of Ricardo's silent death. During his hydrotherapy session, as Marta had planned, the steam from the hot water and the activation of the jets overloaded the faulty circuit of the sabotaged lamp. With a sinister crackle and a shower of sparks, the heavy metal fixture plummeted directly into the tub. The combination of water and electricity was instantaneous and fatal. His screams were muffled by the sound of running water, and by the time help arrived, Sergio was already dead, his body convulsed by the electric current. Marta, who was in another wing at the time, rushed to the scene with other nurses, her expression of shock and horror perfectly rehearsed. She helped pull the body from the water, her hands touching the still warm skin of the man she had just murdered. Dr. Almeida observed the scene with grim gravity. A heart attack was plausible. A bizarre accident with old equipment was also plausible. But 2 deaths in less than a month involving 2 members of the same group of criminals defied the laws of probability. This was no longer a coincidence. It was a pattern. He ordered the hydrotherapy wing closed and initiated an internal review of all safety protocols. His suspicion of Marta intensified, hardening into a near certainty. He began to question her more directly, disguising his inquiries as casual conversations. "It's a lot of tragedy for such a new nurse," he commented, his eyes fixed on hers, searching for any crack in her armor. "This place seems to be rejecting certain people." The tension between them became a game of psychological chess. Every conversation was a battlefield of unspoken words and hidden meanings. Marta knew he suspected, and he knew that she knew. She answered his questions with a mix of naivete and professionalism, lamenting the terrible fatalities and expressing concern for patient safety. She was the model nurse, and he didn't have a single piece of evidence to challenge that image. Almeida's frustration grew as he found himself fighting a ghost, a cold and methodical intelligence that left no traces. He was convinced there was a predator in his hospital, but to everyone else, Marta Vega still looked like a lamb. It was then that the true king on the board made his move. One afternoon, as Marta organized a medicine cabinet, patient 0 approached her, silent as a snake. He didn't threaten her. He simply stood beside her, took a cup of water, and before walking away said in a low voice, almost a whisper in her ear, "That's 2 down. Seems the population of this place is shrinking. It's a shame. They were amusing." He walked away with a mocking smile on his lips, leaving Marta frozen. It wasn't a question nor an accusation. It was a statement. He knew. He was aware of her plan, and rather than fearing her, he seemed to be enjoying the show. The game of cat and mouse was no longer just with Dr. Almeida. Now, she was caught in the sights of her main target. The certainty that patient 0 had unmasked her shattered Marta's confidence. The sense of control she cherished began to slip away, replaced by a growing paranoia. She started to feel the weight of her actions in a different way. It was no longer just the moral burden, but the tactile fear of exposure. The nights became longer, populated by nightmares. In them, she didn't relive her sister's attack, but the final moments of Ricardo and Sergio. She saw their faces, not as monsters, but as men in their last breaths, and she would wake up to the sound of her own scream trapped in her throat. The hunter was beginning to feel the gaze of her prey on the back of her neck, and the line between her and the monsters she hunted grew increasingly blurred. The bathroom mirror became her confessional and her enemy. The woman staring back had her eyes, but the light in them had been extinguished. "I came here seeking vengeance, thinking it would bring some kind of closure, but the darkness I invited into me is consuming me. I wanted to hunt monsters, but I didn't realize that to do so, I had to become one. I no longer know where the old Marta ends and this new creature begins. If you've ever felt lost in your own battle, if you've ever looked at yourself and not recognized who you've become, please subscribe. I need to know that." Someone understands that sometimes the wars we fight on the outside destroy us on the inside. A rare moment of her old identity surfaced during a psychotic break in D-Wing. A young patient, a schizophrenic boy who was not malicious, only confused, was huddled in a corner, terrified by hallucinations. While other staff prepared to forcibly sedate him, Marta approached him calmly. She knelt, ignoring protocol, and began speaking to him in a soft voice, not about reality, but about what he was, seeing. She soothed him, guiding him out of his terror. In that moment she was a nurse, a caregiver. The act of compassion was so instinctive it frightened her. It was a painful reminder of the person she had sacrificed on the altar of her vengeance, and it made her question if any fragment of her could still be saved. Meanwhile, Dr. Almeida's investigation finally bore fruit, however small. While reviewing the pharmacy's inventory logs, he found a tiny discrepancy in the beta block account from the week of Ricardo's death. It was such a small dose that it had been dismissed as a simple accounting error at the time. But now, in light of the second death, the error looked like a clue. He had no way to link the discrepancy directly to Marta, but the finding reinforced his theory. He summoned her to his office under the pretext of discussing staff stress and casually mentioned the mistake in the inventory. He watched her reaction like a hawk, noting the micro-expression, the split. Second, her eyes betrayed a flicker of alarm before becoming impassive again. He now had a thread to pull. The third target, Pedro, presented a different challenge. He was deeply paranoid, rarely leaving his cell and distrusting everyone and everything. Poisoning him or staging an accident was nearly impossible. Marta realized she would have to enter his world of delusion to destroy him. She began to approach him, not as a nurse, but as a confidant. She listened to his conspiracy theories, validating his fears of spies among the staff and messages hidden in the food. Slowly, she inserted herself into his persecution narrative, gaining a trust that no one else in the asylum had. It was the most depraved act she had yet committed, using a man's mental illness as the weapon to kill him, becoming the very demon he believed was haunting him. Her approach to Pedro, however, raised a red flag for Ana. The veteran nurse who saw everything noticed the unusual attention Marta was paying to that specific group of patients. "You're a good kid, Marta, but you're new," Ana warned her over coffee. "Don't get attached to any of them, especially not these ones. They're poison, and don't think the others don't notice who you're watching. In this place, curiosity can get you killed." Ana's warning was genuine, born of an almost motherly concern, but to Marta, it sounded like an alarm. Her cover was wearing thin, not just with her enemies, but also with those who might be her allies. The circle of distrust was closing in around her. The plan for Pedro was cruelly psychological. After becoming his sole confidant, Marta began to systematically feed his paranoia. She would whisper warnings about the guards, leave random objects in his cell for him to interpret as signs, and tamper with his food so he would believe he was being slowly poisoned. She pushed him to the very edge of his own mind. The final step was to suggest that the only way out of his persecution was a final act of defiance. She never said the word suicide, but she planted the seed, wrapping the idea in the language of liberation and escape. She was convincing him to kill himself, and the most terrible part was that he saw her as his savior. The psychological warfare with patient zero escalated. He made no attempt to expose her, preferring a more subtle torment. One day, Marta found a crude, childlike drawing in her locker. It depicted a nurse with a giant syringe standing next to 3 graves, while a fourth figure watched from a distance with a smile. There was no mistaking the message. He wasn't just aware of her actions, he was reveling in them, treating her revenge as his private entertainment. He was daring her, testing her limits, wanting to see how far she would go. Marta realized he didn't see her as a threat, but as an equal, a fellow predator, and this realization filled her with a profound self-loathing. Pedro's death was exactly as she had planned. He was found hanging in his cell, having used braided bedsheets. He left behind an incoherent note speaking of shadows that hunted him and an angel who showed him the only way out. To the administration, it was a tragic and predictable case of suicide, the end result of a collapsing mind. But the death caused a moral panic in the asylum. 3 deaths from the same group in such a short time. The place, already a powder keg of fear and instability, began to combust. The atmosphere became unbearable, thick with paranoia, affecting patients and staff alike. The chaos Marta had sown was now blooming uncontrollably. For Dr. Almeida, Pedro's suicide was the final straw. He knew, with absolute certainty, that a patient so paranoid he feared his own shadow would never trust someone enough to be influenced in that way, unless the manipulator was a master. He marched to the hospital's board and presented his findings: the medication discrepancy, the conveniently exploited safety, failures, and now a psychologically orchestrated suicide. He didn't accuse Marta directly, but he declared his belief that a campaign of extermination was underway. He demanded and was granted authorization for an external investigation. The police were being called. Marta's time had officially run out. The net was closing. Dr. Almeida summoned Marta to his office and informed her of the police investigation set to begin the next morning. He looked her directly in the eye, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "Whoever is behind this will be found. The truth always comes out, Nurse Vega." The threat was crystal clear. Outside, the asylum was simmering with the tension of the impending investigation. Marta knew she had only one night to finish what she started, one night to get to the last name on her list, Patient Zero. But now, the hunt had been reversed. He knew she was coming. He was waiting for her. The final confrontation would not be a silent execution. It would be a duel in the heart of the hell she herself had helped create. Night fell on the asylum like a shroud, thick with a feverish electricity. News of the police investigation had spread like a virus, and the already tense atmosphere had become volatile. Marta knew that time was her enemy. It was then that the bait was laid. A note, neatly folded and left on her workstation, in an elegant handwriting she instantly recognized as that of Patient Zero. It contained only 3 words: surgical wing. Alone. It was the abandoned wing, a labyrinth of dusty operating rooms and rusted equipment, a place where screams would not echo. She knew it was a trap, an arena chosen by her enemy for the final showdown. But backing down was not an option. With her heart beating a funeral march, she filled a syringe with a lethal dose of potassium chloride and concealed a surgical scalpel in the sleeve of her uniform. The huntress was on her way to the wolf's den. As she entered the surgical wing, a shroud of silence enveloped her. Dust danced in the beams of light, filtering through grimy windows, and the smell of formaldehyde and decay hung in the air. The door clicked shut behind her with a resounding thud, plunging her into near-total darkness. Then, the emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie red glow. From the darkness, the voice of Patient Zero echoed, calm and amused. "Welcome, Marta, or should I say, the avenging sister." He emerged from the shadows, not alone. Flanking him were 2 of the most violent inmates from the maximum security wing, their eyes vacant and their smiles cruel. "I know everything," he continued, savoring each word. "The nursing student, the little sister, it's been quite a show watching you work. A performance worthy of applause." At the exact moment he finished his revelation, all hell broke loose. A sharp, deafening alarm began to blare throughout the asylum, followed by screams, the sound of breaking glass and twisting metal. The riot had begun. The fear and paranoia that Marta helped cultivate, combined with the news of the police, was the spark. Patient Zero laughed, a terrible sound that cut through the chaos. "I gave it a little push," he admitted. "A rumor here, an unlocked door there. I thought our meeting deserved a fitting soundtrack. No one is coming to save you, Marta. In the midst of this pandemonium, who will notice one more body? He had orchestrated the asylum's collapse, turning the institution into his weapon and his shield, ensuring their final battle would take place in a world without rules. The ensuing confrontation was first one of words, a battle for Marta's soul. "You say you're different from us," Patient Zero taunted, circling her like a shark. "But you reveled in their fear, didn't you? You felt the power pulsing through your veins with every life you took. You didn't seek justice, you sought power, the same power you accused us of using. You just switched sides in the game." His words were like acid, corroding the justification she had built for herself. He forced her to face the dark truth of her transformation. In her quest to destroy monsters, she had learned their language, adopted their methods, and in the process had become a mirror image of what she hated most. Vengeance had emptied her of everything but the darkness itself. The talk gave way to violence. The two inmates moved in, and the fight was desperate and savage. Marta lacked strength, but she had precision. She used the scalpel not as a weapon of brute force, but of surgical accuracy, targeting tendons and arteries. The chaotic environment, with its dancing shadows and the deafening roar of the riot, was her only ally. She incapacitated one man with a deep cut to his leg and used the syringe on the other, plunging it into his neck in an act of pure survival. But the fight took its toll. She was wounded, with a gash on her arm, and her body aching from the blows. Finally, it was just her and her true target panting, amidst the carnage, in the red, pulsating arena of the surgical wing. He was stronger and quickly overpowered her, throwing her onto an old operating table. His weight pinned her down, and the sadistic smile on his face was a terrifying image from the past, the echo of the trauma that started it all. He grabbed her wrist, trying to wrench the scalpel from her hand. "In the end," he whispered, his foul breath on her face, "you're just another victim." In that moment of utter helplessness, the image of her sister brought her not just pain, but an incandescent fury. It was the final transformation of victim into predator. With a scream that tore from her own throat, she used her free hand to gouge at his eyes, and in his moment of blind agony, she reversed their position and plunged the scalpel into his chest, not once, but several times, in a frenzy of raw, definitive violence. His body went limp on top of hers. The silence in the room was profound, a vacuum at the center of the hurricane of the riot still raging outside. Marta pushed him aside and stood up, trembling. His blood covered her white uniform, a scarlet stain that sealed her pact with the darkness. Her vengeance was complete. The last name on her list had been crossed off. But as she looked at her trembling, blood-soaked hands, she felt no triumph. She felt an abyssal emptiness. She had won, but she had lost herself in the process. The alarm continued to blare, a siren wailing not just for the fall of the asylum, but for the fall of her own soul. The vigilante had become the personification of the monster she had sworn to destroy. Taking advantage of the chaos she had helped foment, Marta moved through the asylum's corridors like a phantom. The riot was at its peak, a symphony of destruction that served as cover for her escape. To the panicked staff and rampaging inmates, she was just another indistinct figure in the madness. In an abandoned locker room, she tore off the nurse's uniform, now a blood-soaked shroud, and left it on the floor like a snakeskin. Changing into the civilian clothes she had stashed, she became anonymous again. She found an exit at the back of the complex, where the fence had been torn down by the rioters. As she crossed the asylum's boundary and felt the cold night air on her face, she felt no relief, no freedom. She felt only the crushing weight of a journey that had taken her to hell and abandoned her at its gate, forever scarred by its flames. Weeks later, the dust settled, revealing a convenient and incomplete official narrative. The riot at the Sanatorio Belmonte was classified as the worst disaster in the history of the state's psychiatric system. The deaths, including that of Patient Zero, were attributed to inmate violence. The prior accidents and suicide were appended to the report as factors contributing to the facility's instability. Nurse Marta Vega was listed as missing and presumed dead in the riot, a tragic victim of the institution she had come to serve. Only Dr. Almeida, in his haunted silence, knew the truth was far more complex and terrifying. The system, which had failed to protect Marta's sister, now failed to acknowledge her avenger's existence, erasing her story with the same indifferent bureaucracy that had created the monster in the first place. Far away, in a grey port city where no one knew her name, a woman named Helena served coffee in a cheap diner. Her life was a tapestry of monotonous routines, a self-imposed exile to atone for her sins. Marta Vega was dead, but her ghost lived in Helena's eyes. She was free from pursuit, free from the asylum, but she was a prisoner of her own memory. Vengeance, which she had believed would be a cleansing fire, proved to be a slow-acting poison that had corroded her ability to feel joy, peace, or connection. She had rebalanced the scales of justice, but the price was her own humanity, leaving her in a perpetual purgatory, walking among the living but hollow inside. One night, as she wiped down tables after the last customer had left, she saw her reflection in the dark glass of the diner window. The woman staring back was a stranger, her face etched with a hardness that wasn't there before, her eyes holding secrets that could never be told. On the TV in the corner of the bar, a news report told of another case of injustice, of a criminal acquitted on a technicality. Marta, or Helena, felt a familiar chill, a twitch of a muscle in her heart she thought was dead. The darkness within her, the entity she had fed and unleashed in the asylum, had not disappeared. It was merely dormant, waiting for a new reason to awaken. Her war may have been over, but the world's battle continued, and she was now one of its shadow soldiers. My story ends here, in this seaside cafe, with the smell of coffee and the weight of ghosts. I did what I had to do, and I live with the consequences every day. I thank every one of you who listened to my account to the end, who dared to look into the abyss with me. My journey may be unique, but the injustice that caused it is not. That is why I make one last request of you. Subscribe and help keep this space alive. Not for my sake, but so that other stories like mine, the stories of those the system has forgotten, can be told. Let my confession serve as a warning that when justice sleeps, monsters awaken, and sometimes new monsters must be created to hunt them.